Welcome to Verba English. Learn and enjoy.
1. Introduction. The United States and China are two very large countries. They buy and sell many things to each other. This is called trade. Trade between the U.S. and China is very important for the world economy. Many companies and workers need this trade. When trade is easy between them, businesses can grow. People can also buy many different kinds of products. A very large amount of goods travels between the U.S. and China. Think about things you use daily. Many clothes, phones, computers, and toys are made in China and sold in the U.S. The U.S. buys goods worth hundreds of billions of dollars from China every year. In one recent year, this amount was nearly $440 billion. China also buys American goods like farm products and airplanes. This big trade connects the two countries strongly. But problems started in the trade relationship between the U.S. and China. The U.S. government wanted to make changes. U.S. leaders felt the trade was not fair. They worried that the U.S. bought much more from China than China bought from the U.S. They also had worries about other things, like technology sharing. These worries led to talks about new taxes on goods from China. This began a difficult time for U.S.-China trade. These new taxes are called tariffs. A tariff is a tax that a government adds to goods coming from another country. When a country puts a tariff on a product, that product usually becomes more expensive to buy. For example, if the U.S. puts a tariff on Chinese phones, the price of those phones might increase in U.S. shops. Governments use tariffs for different reasons. They might want to help companies in their own country, or they might use tariffs to try and change trade rules. Tariffs can make trade harder and more expensive. This book looks at the trade problems between the U.S. and China. We will learn why the U.S. government started using tariffs. We will see which goods got tariffs first and how both countries responded. We will understand how these tariffs changed the prices of products. We will also look at the effects on factories and jobs in the U.S. and China. Other countries watched this situation, and we will discuss their views. Finally, we will examine the results of these trade actions and think about the future relationship between the U.S. and China. 2. Why the tariffs started. The new taxes, or tariffs, on goods traded between the United States and China did not begin without reasons. The U.S. government explained why it felt these tariffs were needed. One big reason was the trade balance between the two countries. For many years, the United States bought a lot more products from China than China bought from the United States. Think about clothes, toys, and electronics. Many of these came from China to America. The U.S. sold things like farm goods and airplanes to China, but the total amount was much less. This difference in buying and selling is called a trade deficit. The U.S. government worried that this large trade deficit was not good for the American economy or American jobs. They felt the trade was not balanced or fair. Another important reason was about technology and ideas. American companies create new inventions and have special ways of making things. The U.S. government said that China was not protecting these American ideas. They were concerned that some Chinese companies were copying American products unfairly. There were also worries that American companies wanting to sell their products in China sometimes had to share their secret technology. U.S. officials felt this pressure to share technology was wrong. They believed these actions hurt American businesses and their ability to create new things. Of course, China saw things differently. The Chinese government did not agree with the American reasons for the tariffs. They often said that their trade practices were normal for a country growing as fast as China. They felt they were following global trade rules. Chinese leaders also pointed out that China is a very large and strong country with a long history. They stated that the world market is big. If the United States made trade difficult, China could increase its trade with other countries in Europe, Asia, and Africa. They felt they did not depend only on the U.S. market. They were prepared to protect their own economy and interests. The main goal for the U.S. government in starting the tariffs was to change the trade relationship with China. They wanted China to change some of its rules and actions related to trade, technology, and how foreign companies could work in China. The hope was that the pressure from the tariffs would lead to new talks and a new agreement. This new agreement, the U.S. government hoped, would make trade feel more fair and balanced for everyone involved, especially for American workers and companies. 3. The first taxes on goods. The new taxes, called tariffs, did not all start at once. The United States government began adding these extra costs to Chinese goods in the year 2018. It happened in stages. First, the government announced taxes on some types of goods. Then, a short time later, it added taxes to more goods. This was the beginning of the changes in trade rules between the two countries. This was new for businesses trading between the U.S. and China. Many people watched closely to see what would happen next. What kinds of goods from China got these first new taxes? At the start, the U.S. government focused on specific types of products. Many of these were things used to make other products. For example, parts for machines, electronic parts, and different kinds of equipment were included. The idea was to tax goods important to certain industries in China. Later, the lists grew longer and included more items that people buy in shops, like clothes or home goods. But the first steps targeted goods used by factories and businesses more than things bought directly by shoppers. China did not wait long to answer. When the U.S. put taxes on Chinese goods, the Chinese government quickly put new taxes on American goods. This is called retaliation. China made its own list of U.S. products that would have extra costs. These lists often included important American exports. For example, farm products like soybeans were taxed. Cars made in the U.S. also faced new tariffs when going to China. This showed that China was ready to use taxes too. It became a back-and-forth action. Businesses in both the United States and China felt worried when the first tariff started. Company leaders were unsure about what would happen next. It became harder to plan for the future. Would the taxes go higher? Would more products be added to the lists? This uncertainty was difficult for businesses. Companies that used parts from China worried about higher costs. Companies that sold products to China worried about losing customers because their goods were now more expensive there. Some businesses thought about finding new places to buy or sell, but changing suppliers or factories is slow. The news about the tariffs quickly affected the financial markets. Stock markets around the world often went up and down more than usual. When new tariffs were announced, stock prices sometimes dropped. This happened because investors worried about how the taxes would affect businesses and the economy. They worried that the tariffs could slow down trade and make companies earn less money. This early reaction showed the trade problems were seen as a risk for the world economy. The people were unsure how bad the situation could get. 4. More tariffs and talking. After the first taxes on goods started, the trade problems between the United States and China grew bigger. The tariffs, which are special taxes on goods coming from other countries, did not stop. Instead, both countries added more tariffs. This meant that the taxes became higher, and the cost of trading goods between the two countries went up more. More types of products were put on the tariff lists. First, some goods were taxed, but later the lists grew longer. This included many things that people buy every day, like clothes and electronics. The U.S. bought a very large amount of goods from China each year, worth many billions of dollars. So, when more goods got new taxes, more businesses felt the change. Companies in the U.S. that used parts from China found it more expensive. China also added taxes to more American goods, making them more expensive for people in China to buy. While the tariffs were increasing, leaders and officials from the U.S. and China tried to talk. They had meetings to discuss the problems. The goal of these talks was to find a way to stop adding more tariffs and maybe remove some. Both sides wanted to make a deal, but it was not easy. They needed to agree on many difficult topics. During the trade talks, officials discussed the main reasons for the tariffs. The U.S. officials talked about the trade deficit, which means the U.S. was buying much more from China than it was selling to China. They also talked about technology and making trade fairer. Chinese officials explained their side. They talked about their own country's needs and plans. They did not agree with all the complaints from the U.S. Finding an agreement was very challenging. Both countries had different ideas about trade. Sometimes, the U.S. government changed its plans about tariffs quickly, which made it hard for businesses and for the talks. China also showed that it was strong. Chinese officials said their country had a long history and could manage without the U.S. market if needed. They said China could trade with many other countries around the world. Because both sides felt strongly about their positions, making a deal that worked for everyone took a lot of time and effort. The talks continued, but the challenges remained. 5. How prices changed. Tariffs are special taxes on goods that come from other countries. When the government puts a tariff on a product, like a phone or clothes from China, that product usually becomes more expensive to buy in the U.S. This is because the company that brings the product into the country has to pay the tax. They often add this cost to the price you pay in the store. Both the U.S. and China added these taxes to goods from the other country. The U.S. put very high taxes, like 145% on some Chinese goods. China answered with its own high taxes, like 125% on U.S. goods. Because the U.S. put large taxes on many Chinese goods, the prices of these items started to go up. The U.S. buys a lot from China, like electronics, toys, and clothes. For example, people worried that the price of things like iPhones could increase a lot. One estimate said a phone costing about $1,200 might go up by over $900 because of the tariffs. However, the government later said some electronics like smartphones and computers would not have these new taxes. Still, many other goods were affected, including imports from many countries which faced a 10% tax. People started to feel the higher prices when they went shopping. Buying everyday things became more difficult for some families as costs added up. Many American companies use parts or materials from China to make their own products. When tariffs made these Chinese imports more expensive, it cost U.S. companies more money to make their goods. These companies then had a difficult choice. They could make their own prices higher for customers, or they could make less profit. This was hard for many businesses, especially smaller ones that could not easily find other places to buy parts. The price changes also went the other way. China put its own tariffs on goods coming from the U.S. This made American products more expensive for people and businesses in China. U.S. companies that sold things like farm products or fish to China found it harder to sell there. For example, lobster sellers in the U.S. lost sales because their lobsters became too expensive in China due to the Chinese tariffs. China said it could buy lobster from other places. This hurt American workers and businesses, like farmers and fishermen, that relied on selling to China. Chinese businesses also faced problems. The U.S. tariffs made their goods more expensive for Americans to buy. This meant they could sell less to the large U.S. market. While China looked for other countries to trade with, losing sales in the U.S. affected many Chinese companies and workers too. The tariffs created difficulties for businesses on both sides, changing how they operated and what things cost for everyone. 6 factories and jobs. People had different ideas about the tariffs and jobs. Some people hoped the tariffs would create more jobs in the United States. They thought higher taxes on Chinese goods would encourage companies to hire American workers. Others worried that the tariffs would actually cause job losses. They thought higher costs for businesses could lead to companies hiring fewer people. It was a big question with no easy answer. Were these new taxes good or bad for American workers overall? The effects were different for different groups and industries. One main goal of the tariffs was to help American factories grow. The government hoped that making Chinese goods more expensive would lead companies to build factories and make more things in the U.S. This could mean more manufacturing jobs. However, the United States economy has changed a lot over many years. It is not mainly focused on manufacturing like it once was. Even if companies wanted to bring factory work back, it is not a simple or quick process. Some industries felt the negative effects quite strongly. Technology companies, for example, were concerned. Many popular electronics like smartphones and computers use parts from China or are assembled there. Higher tariffs meant these products could become much more expensive for people to buy. Farmers also faced serious problems. China responded to U.S. tariffs by putting its own tariffs on American farm goods. This made it much harder and more expensive for U.S. farmers to sell products like soybeans, fruit, and meat to the large Chinese market. This hurt businesses and jobs in farming communities across the country. Fishermen, such as those selling lobster, also found their sales to China dropped. Because of the higher costs and the uncertainty caused by the tariffs, some companies started thinking about moving their production. They looked at other countries besides China where they could make their goods. Some also considered moving production back to the United States to avoid the tariffs on imports. Companies always want to find ways to keep their costs low and make their business plans more predictable. But moving factories is very difficult, expensive, and slow. You cannot just build a new factory in a few weeks. It takes a long time, maybe 3, 4, or even 5 years, to plan and build one. Companies need to think about the future for many years, even decades, when they decide where to build. Business leaders felt unsure about what the trade rules and tariffs would be like in 5 years, 10 years, or longer. The government sometimes changed tariff rules quickly. This constant change and uncertainty made it very risky for companies to spend huge amounts of money building new factories in the US. So, while some wanted manufacturing to return, changing where things are made could not happen quickly. 7. How the world watched. The trade problems between the United States and China were big news everywhere. Other countries around the world watched closely because these issues affected them too. Many governments worried about how the tariffs would change international trade. The situation was not just about two countries, it involved the global economy. Many nations felt the impact directly. The US government put new taxes not only on Chinese goods. It also added tariffs, sometimes around 10%, on products from many other countries. This meant businesses in Europe, Asia, and other parts of the world also faced new challenges when selling goods to the US. It made international business more difficult for everyone. This situation created a lot of uncertainty. Trade rules seemed to change quickly. One day there might be a plan for tariffs, and the next day the plan could change. This made it very hard for companies to make decisions about the future. Businesses need to know what the rules will be for many years, especially when they build new factories, which can take 3, 4, or even 5 years. The constant changes made the world economy feel less stable. Companies started to rethink how they made and moved their products. This system is called the supply chain, how parts get to factories and how finished goods get to shops. Because of the tariffs, some companies looked for ways to move their factories out of China. Others tried to find parts from suppliers in different countries. However, changing supply chains takes a long time and costs a lot of money. It was not a quick or easy solution. China also reacted to the tariffs. Chinese officials said that the world market was very large. They stated that if trade with the US became too difficult, China would trade more with other nations. China worked to make its trade relationships stronger with countries across Asia, Africa, and Europe. At the same time, other countries also started looking for new trade partners. They began trading more with each other, sometimes leaving the US out of their plans. For example, if China stopped buying certain goods like food from the US, it could often buy similar goods from another country. These trade actions between the US and China changed how countries worked together. The focus shifted from global trade rules to actions taken by single countries. The problems between the two large economies sent ripples around the world, affecting businesses, governments, and people everywhere. It showed how connected the global economy is and how actions in one place can have big effects far away. 8. Looking at the results. After some time, the situation with the extra taxes or tariffs between the United States and China continued. Both countries kept high taxes on many goods coming from the other country. For example, at one point, the U.S. put a tax of 145% on Chinese goods, and China put a tax of 125% on U.S. goods. Sometimes, certain products like smartphones and computers were not included in these new taxes, but the general situation was still difficult. These tariffs caused changes in the economy. One big change was the price of goods. Things imported from China became more expensive for people in the U.S. to buy. Also, goods from the U.S. became more expensive in China. This affected many businesses. Companies that used parts from China found their costs went up. American farmers who sold food to China found it harder to sell their products. People started to feel these effects, noticing higher prices for everyday items. Some worried about their money, like savings for retirement, because the economy felt less stable. Not everyone agreed about whether the tariffs were working. Some leaders believed the tariffs were necessary. They hoped the taxes would help American companies and workers over time. They thought it would make trade fairer. However, other people disagreed strongly. They said the tariffs hurt regular people because prices went up. They also pointed out that businesses faced uncertainty and higher costs. China stated that it was prepared for the trade problems and could trade with many other countries around the world, not just the U.S. The relationship between the U.S. and China changed because of the tariffs. Trading goods became more complicated and less friendly. Businesses in both countries and around the world started to think more carefully about where they bought parts or sold their products. Some companies looked for ways to rely less on either the U.S. or China. This created long-term changes in how goods moved around the world. Many questions remained about the future. Businesses found it hard to make long-term plans. They did not know if the tariffs would stay, increase, or decrease. This uncertainty made it difficult to decide where to build new factories, because building a factory takes many years. Would the trade rules change again suddenly? The future of trade between the two large economies was unclear, leaving many people wondering what would happen next.